I don't know, has this podium shrunk or something? I feel, I mean, it's a great theme, you know, writers on writers, but I think it's maybe too broad. I think it should be just tall writers on tall writers. It could be great. Could have me, Will Self, Martin Amis, I don't know, you know. So I feel really pleased to have I feel even more pleased with myself than I usually do. The fact that I've managed to get here. I've sort of sneaked in on this kind of biographers thing without having written a biography. It's one of the great dodges, I think. And today I'm going to move slightly to one side of the biography issue and talk about a related thing, the essayistic novel or the novelistic essay. And I hope you have that handout, which I hope has succeeded in grabbing your attention. And I'm going to frame this talk about the essay and the novel and the supposed compatibility or incompatibility between the two with a few quotations from different people. That's one of the great things about the essay form. You put in lots of quotes to show how clever you are. And whereas, I mean, it would be a good idea when considering this big question to narrow it down, as I was saying about the sort of tall writers thing. I'm actually going to begin by indicating some ways in which it could be expanded. So the first quotation, the first of 4 quotations I'd like to read to you. I think of myself as an essayist, producing essays in novel form, or novels in essay form. Okay, well that's straightforward enough, but then he goes on, only instead of writing, I film them. That's Jean-Luc Godard from an interview in Cahiers du Cinéma in 1962. So I think it's useful to bear in mind the ease with which this topic can be exported from literature to cinema, from page to screen. And actually, while we're at it, I might as well toss in another quotation from Werner Herzog, who said, I've never made a distinction between my feature films and my documentaries. For me, they're all just films. And for what it's worth, that's exactly how I feel about my fiction and non-fiction. Also, I realize that this is great because it means that with a little bit of tweaking, I can give this same lecture again if the theme of the future Key West thing is writers on film. Okay, the Herzog quotation was a bonus one. We're going to move on to the next quotation from Aldous Huxley, another very tall writer, by the way, who described himself, and I love this quote, as some kind of essayist sufficiently ingenious to get away with writing a very limited kind of fiction, which in the unlikely event of anyone being remotely interested is also pretty much how I see myself. The next observation is by Martin Amis, from an essay where he claims that Gore Vidal is, and I quote, too clever to be an effective novelist. Essays are what he's good at. You can't be too clever for them. It's not unusual, I think, to hear people say that they actually value Amis's journalism and essays far more highly than his fiction. And then finally, to complete this quartet of quotations, we have Cynthia Ozick, who sees the two forms as being fundamentally incompatible. True essayists rarely write novels, she says. I guess there's a possible corollary here in that true novelists do not write essays, or at least true novelists do not do so within their novels. That is to say, whereas the essay is firmly and unashamedly anchored in the revealed sensibility of the author, in any novel, any views he or she has are dissolved Shakespeare-like within the dramatized interactions of the characters, so that we can have dialogue about things, but not little lectures pasted in, as it were. I mean, Tolstoy would be a huge case in point, a deeply tendentious writer, but of course he had the good artistic grace and sense to wait till the end of War and Peace before explicitly setting out the theory of history, which had been tacitly and subtly demonstrated by the preceding 1,000 pages of fiction. Well, okay, but it actually requires very little thought to come up with examples of novelists using a character either to give a straightforward lecture or, as in the case of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, where we get a lecture, we just get this lecture, it's really just pasted in, a lecture on Holbein's painting of the dead Christ, and I think that's you've got a sort of photocopy of that incredible picture. And this is Holbein's The Dead Christ. It was in 1867, en route to Geneva, that Dostoevsky first saw this painting, excuse me, and his wife recalls how, I'm quoting, he stood for 20 minutes before the picture without moving. On his agitated face, there was the frightened expression I often noticed on it during the first moments of his epileptic fits. He had no fit at the time, but he could never forget the sensation he'd experienced in the Basel Museum in 1867. The figure of Christ taken from the cross, whose body already showed signs of decomposition, haunted him like a horrible nightmare. And Dostoevsky comes back to this painting in The Idiot. Prince Mishkin exclaims, "Why, some people may lose their faith by looking at that picture." And later in the book, Dostoevsky includes a whole lecture on the painting by a minor character. And I'll just read you now some little bits from that lecture. The picture depicted Christ, who's just been taken from the cross. In the picture, the face is terribly smashed with blows, tumefied, covered with terrible swollen and blood-stained bruises, the eyes open and squinting. The large open whites of the eyes have a sort of dead and glassy glint. But strange to say, as one looks at the dead body of this tortured man, one cannot help asking oneself the peculiar, arresting question: if such a corpse was seen by all his disciples, then how could they possibly have believed, confronted with such a sight, that this martyr would rise again? The people surrounding the dead man, none of whom is shown in the picture, must have been overwhelmed by a terrible anguish and dismay on the evening which had shattered all their hopes and almost all of their beliefs in one fell blow. They must have parted in a state of the most dreadful terror, though each of them carried away within him a mighty thought which would never be wrested from him. And if, on the eve of the crucifixion, the Master could have seen what he would look like when taken from the cross, would he have mounted the cross and died as he did? This question, too, you can't help asking yourself as you look at the picture. I guess you could argue that passage by Dostoevsky is a good instance of the kind of thing that has led some people to claim that Dostoevsky is a rather clumsy novelist, albeit a very profound thinker. But it doesn't require much thought at all to come up with similar lectures or essays in other books. There is, for example, the famous essay on the disintegration of values in Hermann Brock's The Sleepwalkers. Now, novels are often tacitly about, or are written in response to, ones that have gone before. They are, in other words, in some ways, dramatized essays about these earlier novels. This idea has been best expressed by George Steiner in the opening part of his great book, Real Presences, where he points out that the